Hello, this is John Huey, and I'm here with my co-host Michael Tingley once again for the second episode of the Sober Atheist podcast. We hope you enjoyed the first one, those of you that saw it, and if you didn't, and this is your first exposure to our beautiful faces, or voices, as it were, we'll be happy to accommodate you with an episode that makes some sense. And in that vein, the title of this episode is episode 2. It's how we did it without God, faith, steps, or spirituality. And this came from some viewer feedback, primarily from people that we know. Actually, all of them were from people we know. And, some of the comments included words to the effect of, well, why don't you guys talk about how you did it? And literally how you did it, because most of us know how the other way works. How did you do this way? And I thought about it, and I thought that at least from my point of view, I'm going to talk about primarily some things from my early days. I don't know what Michael's perspective is, but I guess I'll find out right now.
You'll find out.
I guess I'll find, since it's totally ad hoc and off the top of our heads this time. Yeah, I'd love to find out.
Well, you want me to start? And
yeah, you can start, and I can follow, or we can switch around however you want to do it. It's
well, I'll
always
just
cool.
throw out there a little bit of little bit of background. I mean, where I've come from and how long I was using and how long I've been sober. I've been sober 18 years, a little over 18 years this time. And I've often said that this is my third time at trying to be sober, but I looked at my medical records today, and this is actually my fourth time. And I started drinking in junior high school, like 14, 15 years old, whenever I could get something to drink. And, it just seemed like normal behavior for everybody back then. And I didn't really start drinking seriously until I got my driver's license. And so from 16 on, drinking alcohol and drugs were just a part of my life. I am of the Woodstock generation, so there was a lot of drugs, and it seemed like just normal life to drink and drug. It never occurred to me that there was any issue with that, other than trying to avoid getting caught driving under the influence, which was a challenge that some of us were lucky enough to get through. Anyway, yeah, I didn't really start trying to get sober until let me go back. The first time I was accused of being an alcoholic, and it's the first time really the word alcoholic even came into my vocabulary. My first wife, who I'd been married to for 5 years at that point, said that she loved me, but she could not live with an alcoholic. And that was the first time I heard that label, that term applied to me. And it went right over my head. It was like, no, I'm not an alcoholic. I just like to party a lot more than she did. And that's how I thought. And so I completely ignored that word alcoholic for a long time, too long, of course, until I ended up years later addicted to heroin. And I bring that up because I am very grateful for having had that experience, because I think without it, I would never have even tried to get sober. To actually learn what addiction was a real turning point in my life. I never thought of alcohol as being addictive. I mean, we just drank. I mean, it wasn't like heroin, and heroin was so addictive and so instantly addictive And the detoxing from all that whole experience was just, ultimately horrible, like everybody has if they get into that stuff. But it was the first time that I realized that I needed to get help. I needed to get clean and sober. So I went to a hospital detox on my birthday, my 37th birthday, 1988. And I checked in because I realized that I was addicted to heroin. Even though, I knew I still drank every single day. I mean, I never stopped. And so being in that detox ward was my first exposure to how people got clean and sober. And it was all AA and NA. There was the counseling and there was all that stuff going on. So that was my first exposure to that concept and it was pretty much drilled into our heads that if you wanted to be clean and sober, this is what you had to do. You had to go to AA and NA and do the whole deal. And I walked away from that hospital detox after 11 days and they said, good luck, go to meetings. So that was my first experience with meetings. I went to meetings a couple of times, literally on the way walking across town. And I lasted 5 days. I stayed clean and sober for 5 days. So I wasn't really ready. So then I went into a 28-day rehab. I checked in because I realized that it was hopeless. There's just no way. And again, in that 28-day rehab, it was all AA, a little bit of NA, but it was primarily AA. And it was that first experience with actually, holding hands and praying and doing the whole shebang, and I remember thinking at the time that, I don't really believe this stuff, but I know that I have to just say it. I have to go along, you just do it because you're convinced that this is the only thing you can do. So I did it. I played the game as well as I could, I mean, I participated in thousands and thousands of meetings from then on for a good solid year. And the thing about the meetings that I went to at the time and looking back on it, there was very little traditional AA involved. I was living in New York City and I found the meetings in the village that were just cool and it was just a fun social experience. But it worked. It worked in that sense. We didn't really do any praying. I don't remember talking about God or anything. It was all about the social activity of just hanging out with other people that are trying to get clean and sober. And it helped. It really did. It worked in that respect because I wasn't fighting that whole belief system and steps and all of that. It was just the social experience, and it worked for a year for me. But I realized that at the end of the year, exactly at the end of the year, I got my 1 year coin at the meeting and walking back home from the meeting, I said to myself, well, that's proof. I'm not an alcoholic. I went for a year without a drink. So how could I possibly be an alcoholic? Stopped at a liquor store on the way home. And, from then on, it was like the same thing, man, just right back into it. And I, it was tough. It got dark, years and years of that stuff, drinking and drugging. I'm lucky to have survived. A lot of the people that I hung out with and, shared drugs and alcohol with ended up dead. And I was very, very lucky to get through that alive. Anyway, then the next step for me was I got into a methadone program. And that's when I realized that I couldn't drink either. I had to stop drinking because it just didn't mix. There's no cocktail that fits with methadone. And so that was my first time really accepting the fact that I got to stop drinking. This is crazy. Anyway, I tried, I tried the AA way for years and years and years. I went to 1,000 meetings and I held hands and said the prayers and I did all that stuff. And I was a sponsor. I was a sponsee. I wrote down steps and did all that stuff. all the time, just pretending. I mean, it was just, again, it was because I knew that that was the only thing I could do to stay clean and sober, was to do AA. And so I did it. I went along with it. And it wasn't until years into it this time, about 10 years into my sobriety this time around, that I've reached a level of honesty, uh, and fully admitted to everyone that I didn't believe any of this stuff we were talking about in the meetings. I didn't believe in God, and none of this is helping me stay sober. The only reason I'm sober is because I'm hanging out with you guys, and showing up and talking the talk and doing all that stuff. But I was sober because I was hanging out with other people trying to get sober. It wasn't that the steps were helping me. They weren't, the prayers weren't helping me. I didn't believe any of that stuff. So when I reached that level of honesty, it was a major turning point for me to really admit that this stuff isn't working. And then the pandemic hit, and we found the AA Agnostica and the Zoom meetings, and I was just shocked, and pleasantly shocked and surprised to find out how many people on this planet are staying clean and sober without God and without AA, without doing steps. I mean, and it's strange looking back, all the old timers that I knew in meetings, people that were 30, 35 years sober, they never talked about the steps. They never talked about God. They were there at those meetings, doing the thing, but that wasn't what was keeping them sober. And I realize that now. It was us doing this, just talking about it, and showing up, and helping each other, stay sober, without all that ritual, without the belief in God, believing in ourselves primarily, believing in the fact that we can do this. And all it takes is us sharing with each other, and spending a little time with each other and being honest about it. I'm amazed at how simple this has become for me, without all of that ritual stuff, all that traditional stuff that was driven into my head. I mean, when I say I went to thousands and thousands of meetings, I mean, that's a lot. And to have to bear through that without really even hearing any of it, it was all still just the simplicity of us talking to each other and sharing our experience and helping each other. Yeah, I'm amazed that how simple it is now in hindsight, and how much time I spent just, wandering around pretending, instead of being
Well,
honest.
that's the thing, okay? The
Yes, the
pretense.
honesty, really.
Well, the honesty on the one side and the pretense on the other. I mean, I don't know what kind of old timers you had there in New York City. They're probably very different from the ones I encountered. The old, the hardcore here in DC. Um, I had two guys I communicated with frequently when I first started. One of him, whom I mentioned in the last episode, Brother John, who I saw at my first meeting. But the other one, who I want to talk about right now, is a guy by the name of Jeremiah, old time politician from Massachusetts, who, when I met him, was the senior legislative aide of a crooked congressman in California, who I had to make calls on for my employer due to some business issues we had with the government at the time, and who was my job to get fixed. But when I came in, Jeremiah had let slip somehow or another the fact that he was a recovering person. And when I came in, I mentioned that to him, and he sort of took me under his wing up into the U.S. Capitol wing of this thing. Okay. And there on Tuesday morning, every Tuesday morning at 8 a.m., on the House side, and H310 was a meeting called the Yays and Nays. And sitting up there on the dais were either all three of, or at least one of, something that was referred to here in Washington as the Boys of 63. They had even a cute little moniker for themselves. And these guys were very prominent guys within that fellowship. There was one by the name of Hal Marley who became famous throughout the US and I believe even overseas. His moniker was Mr. Attitude of Gratitude. That was Hal Marley. And then there was the infamous Sandy Beach, who was there, a friend
Oh,
of Jeremiah's.
his tapes were an
Who,
absolute necessity. We had to have those
yeah,
tapes.
well, he was, the bumper sticker that was popular in Washington amongst program people. They literally made the bumper sticker, and you would see it around. It said, "Honk if you've been married to Sandy Beach," because he had a running joke over his 5 or 6 marriages, whatever that was. All right. And then there was a guy that those two would sit up on the dais at the meeting. They were sort of like gods, they would sit up there. But there was another member of the Boys of 63 who wasn't as well known. And this guy his name was Ed Chandler. Now, all of these people were influenced by that thing called Roman Catholicism. I believe they all had a firm foundation in that holy ancient church of Rome. And Ed looked like the deacon of the cathedral, not the regular Catholic church, but he was a lobbyist. And, Jeremiah sent me down to the Dirksen Senate office building cafeteria one day for an hour with Ed Chandler, right? And I could tell the second I said I was an atheist, his face completely changed and hardened. And it was like, somebody had revealed that they were a charter member of the Manson family or something. Okay. It was not good. And the word that came back he didn't tell me this. I somehow made it through an hour with this guy and politely got up and pushed my awful Senate cafeteria chicken. The senators eat in a different place, but in the old days, the Senate cafeteria was such a great place. I pushed my rubber chicken away, and I talked to my friend Jeremiah, who was actually a very cool guy and very cool with who I was. And he says, "Yeah, it's too bad. It won't work out talking to Ed again because he says you'll never make it." Jeremiah said that to me. So the fundamentalists, a lot of them thought that someone like me would never make it. And I basically said, fuck that. Okay. I'm not going to let someone else determine my fate. I decided that I'm really in need of stopping drinking and that I'm going to do this. I'm not going to do this thing per se, but I need the connection with other people. That's why I really felt immediately that I needed that connection with other people that were trotting that path. And, 1987, people weren't really, the world at large wasn't discussing this as much as they do now. And, really the only way you could get the level of communication, if that's what you needed and what you wanted was a level of communication, was in those groups. So I had to find the things that I heard that made sense to me. And I'll tell one. Well, I probably won't just tell one anecdote, but
Well, did you go to a lot of meetings when you first got sober?
oh well,
Was
yeah,
it?
every day. Okay, I
Yeah.
immediately knew that. I said in the first episode about stopping and starting from back in, 85 and then picking up again and then going out and having this horrible slide down to the bottom, at least the lowest bottom I was going to hit. without dying. And I wore out a perfectly really good pair of shoes walking back and forth to that noon meeting that I went to every day. From 23rd and M over to Connecticut Avenue next to the cathedral there. Uh, uh, and I did that. I did that every day. I did it on weekends too. I would go to my office and work and then go to a freaking meeting. And I was working a lot in those days too. I was traveling a lot. But there were things there, even though I immediately rejected this God notion. I mean, they would come up to me after the meeting. Literally, my first year, people would come up to me after regularly and they'd put their hand lovingly on my shoulder and say something like, we just all know you're going to get it sooner or later.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
37 years later, I never got it. Okay. But I did get the benefit of some of those things that they wanted you to do. And not any of the ritual or the praying or the steps or the need, but one of their things at this particular meeting I went to at noon was going and doing service in some of these places, institutional places. And I had one guy one day came up to me and he says, I think they need to hear from you at Carrick Hall. And I say, what's Carrick Hall? And he described to me that it was the DC detox at the old DC General Hospital in a part of Washington, far northeast. I didn't even know where it was. I was totally outside my world completely. And I said, you want me to go to the DC General Detox? And he says, yeah, here's the address. And when you go there, ask for so and so. And I said, what do I do there? And I said, well, get up and talk about your story for 30, 40 minutes. And that's all you need to do. Okay. And I went there and it was what I thought it was going to be. It was a very sad, very tough place for inner city folks. And I said, how am I going to get through this? Well, I did. And, nobody threw anything at me. And, I got polite applause at the end and a thank you from the moderator there. And the thing ended and I was on my way out. And this guy comes up to me. He's a kind of a wispy white guy, which is very unusual there to see a white guy at the DC General Detox. There were maybe out of 150 people I saw there were maybe two white guys, white people there. And the guy started talking to me, and it was clear from his first sentence that he was educated somewhere in the Ivy League. I could hear the intonation. He was certainly went to a classier college. He didn't go to the little hippie college in Vermont. He went to one of the big places, right? Mm-hmm. One of the real joints in Cambridge or, someplace like that, or Princeton or someplace like that. And he starts talking to me and he tells me, this is my third time at Carrick Hall Detox. And he had been a State Department high-level Foreign Service officer posted in some of the most critical and dangerous posts around the world. In those days, you had to have an Ivy League degree and have a certain kind of suit. Not like that anymore, but in those days, it was a very exclusive joint.
And it's all just spy shit, right? It's just spy shit, right?
Well, it's all kinds of shit. You never can tell with them. But this guy, the story with this guy was
political corporatism to the max.
They have a special contract with a joint up in Pennsylvania. It's a special detox for special people, and they take people up there to dry out in privacy, okay? And to be a high-level FSO and to be thrown out, okay, because of your drinking, you really gotta be bad. I mean, it's bad news. It's really bad news to get thrown out of the U.S. Foreign Service.
I
It's
bet.
not a
Well, imagine everybody
it
drinks. So it's, yeah, you got
well,
to
yeah,
be
they
pretty
all drink in
extreme.
their own a lot of them are drunks, but you
Yeah.
gotta be really extreme and have done something to get put out of the country you're in,
Mhm.
maybe diplomatic, asked to leave or something like that. Really hard. And this guy told me it was his 3rd trip through Carrick Hall. So after being thrown out of the State Department, which, by the way, the very first good employee assistance program in the US government was founded by this boy of 63, Hal Marley, back in the late 70s or so. And, that was the first, uh, uh, EAP in the federal government was at the U.S. State Department. They were
Wow.
very progressive in their embrace of treatment rather than, in the old days, they would just
Mhm.
put you in a black car and you'd disappear somewhere. But it really knocked the shit out of me because this guy had a better education than I had. And, he wasn't I had a pretty good job, but he had a much more prestigious job than I could hope to have had with my background in this crazy town. And he spoke and acted like an articulate, educated, capable guy. And the last thing I think the thing he said to me, he said, "Be very careful because I just can't stop." He said that to me.
Well, how did that
He was
affect
being
you? How did that, did you
profoundly affected
identify
me
with that? Did you think, oh,
I
that's me?
profoundly affected me, profoundly. It said it said, someone way above on the pecking order in the little society I was familiar with,
Mhm.
somebody at, right up in they could end up in a much worse place than I had ever been yet. Okay? Yet.
Yeah.
And that was the thing. It was the yet. And that really scared the living shit out of me because I knew that if Carrick Hall was there waiting for a guy like this, it most definitely and worse was there waiting for me because I was headed to Carrick Hall. I was headed for the point at which the police would have had me in hand at some point in time. So, from the point of view of that other program, if you use shoe leather and you work hard and understand that you need some sort of daily commitment, not to these ridiculous ideas that they propound, but to the fact that you need to be cognizant of your alcoholism, acknowledge it on a regular basis, communicate with others, and then attempt at least to be of some use in the context of, you know, addiction and recovery, then maybe you've got a chance, right?
Mhm.
Uh, and that really stuck to me. The dailiness and the regularity of it and the consequence. I really got a sense of consequence. I was recently talking to someone who I believe is going to die of this condition in the not too far distant future, who uh, it's a very hard and very sad case. But instead of talking about recovery, the last time he talked to me, he called me up to say, oh, the condition of the world is so terrible that my only response to the condition of the world was to take a drink.
Mhm.
And here's a guy who's been in and out of programs since the 90s. Oh, and I was speechless. I said, I, I what can I say? All right. If you don't know that the only concern you should have today is not drinking, then my attempts at assistance are really not going to be very effective. If you don't at least accept the proposition today that your number one priority is not drinking. And that somehow or another, not from the boys of 63 and all that BS. Only thing I ever learned in that room, that was it was very hierarchical. I was like I was almost like a cleanup boy in the back of the room or something. I don't know. But I was sitting toward the front. The prestige of the people increased the further you got to the front, right? Somehow or another, I got seated next to a guy. And I looked over at him, and somehow or another he mentioned his name, and I looked at his face and I heard his name, and I said, and I'd heard that somehow or another when his father died, he'd ended up in Georgetown. And I sort of heard that, knew that. It was one of the wealthiest people in the United States sitting next to me, the heir to a gigantic multi-billion-dollar media empire. Or he and his sister, I guess, the two of them, because his mom and dad were dead. And the only thing that impressed me about him was what is he doing here in this funky meeting at 8 a.m. in the Capitol, sitting here listening to Hal Marley talking about attitude of gratitude and all this stuff. If there was a way to buy your way out of this, all right, this guy could have bought a hospital in Switzerland and staffed it with doctors. He could have done that. All he had to do was call his accountant and done it, right? And he's sitting in the same spot that I am, little old x-ray salesman with his tiny little office down at 23rd and M, hustling machines to government agencies. And here's the billionaire with the classic art in his home in Georgetown, it just sit next to me. That made a big impression.
Yeah. Yeah.
That we need something other than money, prestige, position, whatever we have. Or on the other end of the spectrum, we need something other than the misery we're living in moment to moment to drive us forward. And that is the desire, the honest desire to be sober that you acquire through that moment of decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's the rest of this crap they try to sell you, spirituality, steps, faith. You've got to have faith. What is this crap? God? What is God? I mean, I told you first episode. I mean, I rejected the concept of God when I was a little kid. You're going to tell me I'm going to go back to being a 7-year-old? Come on. Don't try to feed me that stuff, but tell me that I can learn from others, that I can understand the power of example, and that I can do some good in the world as a result of that. I don't need that stuff. And I suspect there may be others listening to us that don't need it either. I'm trying to convince people of anything is that it's just a couple of basic principles. And at the first, I go back to how many meetings I went to. I went to meetings all the time. I talked to people all the time. I became very involved in my own recovery on a daily basis. That seemed to do a lot of good for me. Might not do a lot of good for everyone, but did a lot of good for me. So, it's we're looking for success, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
How do
my
we
first exposure to meetings, like I said before, was back in New York City, and I remember being inspired and impressed by seeing celebrities and yeah, people that were in expensive suits and had big jobs and all this corporate people and doctors and lawyers, firemen and policemen. That was the most important exposure for me to that the connection that people are making and the common denominator amongst all of us and the equalizer amongst all of us is that we're all just trying to stay sober. Now, when I look back at that, those were kind of innocent years where the steps didn't matter and there was very little discussion of any of that stuff. It was all just making those connections with other people and being honest with each other. So now when I jump ahead to the years that I just experienced just before getting sober this time and just after getting sober this time, I'm amazed at how much more uh, concentration on the rituals and the steps and all of that and God, how much more important that was, and I started to lose interest in it, and began losing those connections with people because of the barrier of all that stuff going on. Instead of just sitting down and talking to another person who's trying to stay sober, having to memorize the steps and work the steps and write them down and repeat them every single meeting. You know, in a way, I'm grateful for having experienced that because I can really appreciate the simplicity of what we're doing now, and the fact that I don't have to have a belief in God, and that I don't have to do 12 steps every day. I can just live and experience and reaffirm my desire to stay sober just by talking to other people who are trying to stay sober.
Oh,
The
yeah.
simplicity of this is just amazing. And yeah, like I say, when I think back to those first couple of years back in 1988, it was this. It was much more of just the connection between other people trying to stay sober. Very simple.
Well, it's that reaffirming part and the shoe leather part. I think when you're just getting started, that part is, and just understanding you just can't do this anymore. I mean, there's a bottom that each one of us will not accept waiting for each and every one of us if we go back to our former lifestyle and way of living. For most of us, it's not universally true.
And I had to learn the hard way. I mean, I only stayed sober for a year the first time, and then was out again for about 3 years, and then stayed sober again for 2 years, and then went back out again for another 15, almost 15 years. So it took me a long time to come around to this simple realization that,
Well, yeah, you wonder why any of us die of this, but so many of us do. That's the other mysterious part of it. Um, I want everybody listening who's struggling, or even those that aren't struggling, understand that it's when we talk about negative things that have happened to people that we met in recovery, it's it's I don't want it to sound ghoulish, but it's some of that is selfish because we recall what the alternatives really are. we can recall sitting in the emergency room with someone and looking at the desperate situation in front of you there, you know, and they maybe connect that. In my case, I could connect one of my emergency room visits taking an alcoholic to detox back to a night in 1970 lying in the, you know, old George Washington Hospital ER with my face busted open from a little altercation I had saying the wrong thing to the wrong person, you know. I've still got a little hairline scar here and there to remind me of that lovely evening. But you know that you make connections between others' fate and your own. You mentioned driving drunk. Well, in the old days, young college educated white boys, when stopped by the police, unless you'd had an accident or hurt someone, were much of the time let go.
Oh yeah, I was several times.
Oh yeah,
As long as I didn't have
I
an
was
open container in the car, the cop let me go and just said, "Hey,
I
just be
I
careful and get
I
home." Even though I was
yeah,
so shit faced.
yeah. Yeah, I was totally shit-faced one night in San Francisco in the early '70s and was driving a friend's car with Connecticut plates, and I'm barreling the wrong way down a one-way street, and a cop is at the other end of the block, and he comes up to me, and he could absolutely tell I was shit-faced, and he looks through the window, and he says, "Don't they have one-way streets in Connecticut?" And I said, "Yes, of course, officer." And he said, "Turn this thing around and get out of here." Okay. And that was it. That was it. Turn this thing around and get
Yeah.
out of here. And you know, that doesn't happen these days. The consequences of a DUI can
Mhm.
end if you have a certain type of job, can end your career.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
All right. I mean,
yeah,
there's like bad things happen to alcoholics and addicts who use too much, all right?
yeah.
I got a couple of great stories about those folks too, which maybe we'll have time to share in another venue at another time.
I'm amazed at
But
how little I took it seriously. You know, my sobriety for so long, and the fact that I was drinking. I remember just not thinking it was serious. You know, even though hearing stories about other people, all the tragedies, and having had my stomach pumped myself because of an overdose. And I mean, all those things, I still refuse to take it seriously. I mean, I really just kept telling myself that it wasn't really that bad. And that's how much I really liked drinking. I did not want to give it
well,
up.
yeah,
I
and
knew all the
if
truth, but I didn't want to give it up.
right, we don't. None of us want to give it up. No active alcoholic or addict wants to give it up.
Yeah.
But at some point or another, you either have to give it up or it gets you. All right. Now, you know, if we didn't do anything else in this episode, I think we tried to prove that we, in fact, could do it without God, faith, steps, or spirituality. All right. But I don't think I could have done it at all without some sort of daily reaffirmation, which was a great word that you used to reaffirm
Yeah.
what I was doing. And I
Yeah,
think that
you
was
know, I also
what
have to
it
give
was.
some credit to other people that helped too. I mean,
Oh,
I was
yeah.
blessed with having a support group, you know, people behind me that really helped. You know, man, yeah, I wouldn't have gotten into the last rehab that I went to if it hadn't been for a wonderful social worker who I had been talking to for several years, and and a wife who made sure I had insurance coverage. I mean, that stuff that's real stuff that I'm very very fortunate to have had some help with. And man, I can't imagine doing it alone. And that just brings up the whole thing again. We can't do it alone. We just cannot do this
No,
alone. I mean,
no, most of us can't do it alone. I would say. I don't want to go
yeah,
into we're going to have a guest on sometime soon who will have all kinds of alternative ways to do this thing. But I think it's safe to say for us, we couldn't do it alone. If I hadn't have had the support group, the people I knew, the people I met, I had one old friend from more than 35 years ago over this week, and we were, having a chat about some things, mostly business stuff of his. But I mean, I do have some of those old connections that, I really don't want to live without. I still don't want to live without my connection to a lot of those old early days, even though I utterly and completely rejected their stuff. Now, leave one last little anecdote. I was recently communicating after we did our first podcast episode with an old friend of mine, and I'm certain he knows that I had categorically rejected the steps way back when, 35 years or so ago. But when I mentioned that fact to him again, I had alluded to that in our last episode, and he said, "Yeah, when I heard that, I said I couldn't. I said you must have somehow just come to that because you had to sort of accept at least some of them, right? As no, and I said no, I didn't accept any of them." And he says, "Oh, that's surprising." He says to me, "That's how deeply ingrained the idea that you have to do it that way is." Even the best, smartest folks, some of them just can't believe that people like us exist. But we do. And
yeah,
we'll continue to do our thing. And
yeah,
next time we'll be around with a more scripted approach based on my essay that was going to be the foundation for the fourth episode regarding atheism and sobriety on the old Beyond Belief podcast. And we'll reveal the mysteries of that one next time the folks see us on the screen. And then
so
hopefully we'll start launching the guests.
so bottom line
I'm
is,
sorry,
Chairman,
Mark.
how do you stay sober?
How do you stay sober? Okay.
You,
You
how
make a
you,
decision. How do I stay sober?
how do you, John
I
Huey?
how do how do I stay sober?
Yes,
I reaffirm the decision I made in the first week of January 1987 over and over and over again. I reaffirm and reiterate that decision because I know the implications of going back on that decision.
yeah, yeah,
Still works wonders for me because if at my age I don't have 2 or 3 years to finish the job, it'll be over rather quickly if I decided to reemerge as a Jack Daniels two-fisted drinking bar crawling alcoholic who
yeah,
had magically turned into a 35-year-old guy, because that's the first thing that would happen after 5 or 6 shots of Jack. I would think I was 35 and I'd be getting into all kinds of interesting circumstances because of that fantasy. So, yeah, the alternate. I don't know. How do you do it every day?
I think pretty much the same thing.
Yeah.
I every day I have to recognize how much better it is to be sober than it was drinking. And every day I have to say to myself that I'm gonna stay sober again today because it's just so much better. I mean, there's still a part
Well,
of me, I talk about it
yeah.
all the time. There's still a little kernel in there that thinks, oh man, don't you miss that stuff? Well, yeah, I do. Part of me does. I mean, I've grew up in this culture where alcohol and drinking and all that stuff is a positive part of socializing, all that stuff. So yeah, there's a part of me that misses that. But man, I remember what it was like, and I remember how difficult it was to stop. And I don't want to go back to that. This is much better being sober. I like it. I like it a lot.
Wonderful, wonderful, and I predict great success for you, my friend, down the road. Okay, I think that's a pretty solid
Yeah, yeah. I think
projection.
my
I,
irises are
I,
going to bloom. I think that's the most I can hope for right now. I
well,
think my irises are going to
my
bloom.
my
I guarantee it.
my 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 wife and I, first week of May, we will head to the nursery up near Potomac, and we will come back with a cartload of stuff. And my postage stamp garden, unlike the estate garden that you have,
Yeah.
will emerge.
Actually, I picked
You
my
know.
first flower today. We had a daffodil that bloomed overnight,
Oh, the daff.
March
Now they're
5th.
going
I
to
mean,
say
it's
the
pretty crazy.
atheists are talking about fucking daffodils. They're so this
It's real.
we are
It's real. It's
yeah,
substantial. I can
it's
hold it in my
real.
hand.
Real. It's I love sitting in a chair in the morning in the terrible July heat out there, deciding which tiny thing I'm going to prune next. It's a very deliberate process. It's like
Oh,
a
yeah.
parody of an old person in the garden. Final words of wisdom to impart.
I think we said it all. We keep doing this, and that's what's working.
Right.
I'm grateful for having tried all of the traditional way that we were told to do, but ultimately the simplicity of just keeping this connection going and making being honest about having the strength within ourselves to keep doing this. I used to say at meetings that when people were talking about trying to give God credit for things, I say, yeah, but I'm the one that put the key in the ignition of my car and started it up and drove to the meeting. I mean,
Right.
nobody else did that. I want some credit for having done that. I mean, that's
Well,
essentially what we're doing.
exactly. I mean, if you don't exert the effort, you will not derive the benefit. All right.
Yeah.
I seem to recall my mom saying something about that in like 1959 or something. And you don't get and stay sober unless you are invested in your own recovery. It's not coming from some outside force. It has to come from you, right? That's about the end, right? Are we at the
Yeah.
end? I think maybe we're at the end. And we'll have to say, goodbye for now. And Michael has a wonderful phrase in which he likes to end things, which I'll echo.
Peace and love.
And peace and love to you from the declining members of the age of whatever it was way back when.